Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Even If Project Podcast. I'm Christina, and I'm so excited you guys are here with me today. Today, we're going to be finishing up the last part of John 11. We've been in John 11 for, I think, 3 episodes now. So we're finishing that up today. Jesus has just called Lazarus out of the grave, and this is a man who has been dead for 4 days. And you'd think that this moment would be where everyone finally agrees that Jesus is who he says he is. But that's not what happens. What we're about to read is what comes after this miracle. And honestly, it might be one of the most sobering sections in this entire gospel because it shows us something we don't always like to admit. Even undeniable proof doesn't guarantee belief. And just a quick little reminder before we get started into any reading, I am not a theologian. I am not a Bible expert. I'm just someone who loves God, loves his word, and just wants to keep growing in it right here with you. So if I ever say something you don't agree with or just doesn't sit right with you, send me a message, send me an email, leave me a comment. I would love to look into it further and just keep learning with you and discuss it in the comments together and just keep growing side by side. This is just my opinion on what this means, my interpretation of the Bible. So you might have a different interpretation. That's totally fine. I'm just trying to make it a little bit clearer for people that it's hard to understand the Bible because it was hard for me to understand it. And I just want to make it a little bit easier for whoever wants to listen to it. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get into it today. And before we go ahead and read, we're going to go ahead and pause for a second like we always do and make sure we remember exactly where we are in this setting and time period. Lazarus has just walked out of the grave. This didn't happen in private. It wasn't a quiet moment between Jesus and one family. There was a crowd because remember, Martha and Mary they were mourning him. They were told that Jesus was there. They came out with this crowd and Jesus wept. So they were witnesses. This crowd came out with them. There were people who went home and told others what they saw. Word was spreading fast, and we are only days away from Passover. Now, before we move on, it helps to understand what Passover means here. If you don't know what it is, Passover, and I honestly don't remember if I explained this in the last episode or the one before, so if I did, I apologize. But Passover is when Jewish families remember how God rescued them from slavery in Egypt. It is a story about death passing over, about freedom, about deliverance that came through sacrifice. And if I mess it up in any way, please make it clearer in the comments for us. But that is basically my understanding of what Passover is. So when John says Passover is near, he's not just giving us a date. He's raising the tension here because Jerusalem would have been packed. Emotions would have been high, and I feel like I said that wrong. Roman authorities were watching closely. And now, on top of all of this, a man has just been raised from the dead. This is the worst possible timing and also the most meaningful because this story of deliverance is about to meet the one who will become the deliverance. Jerusalem is filling up. Tension is already high. Roman soldiers are watching everything closely. Religious leaders are on edge. Everyone's paying attention to Jesus now. And here's the key thing to understand in this whole thing. Raising Lazarus didn't just comfort grieving sisters. It changed the temperature of the entire city. From this moment on, Jesus is no longer just controversial. He's dangerous. Not because he did something wrong, because too many people are starting to believe. So what we're about to read isn't about the miracle itself. It's about what the miracle forces people to decide. I forgot my headphones were in. I was outside playing with our dogs, and I put my headphones in to listen to a podcast, and I totally forgot they were in. So that's why I just took those out. But let's go ahead and start reading together. We're going to start with verses, I'm trying to read my notes here, verses 45 through 46. I'm going to be reading from my CSB Bible. If you have a different version, that's totally okay. It may sound a little bit different, but the meaning is still going to be the same. So again, we're going to be starting with verses 45 through 46. And that says, "Therefore, many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw what he did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done." So Jesus has just raised Lazarus from the dead in the last episode that we listened to, or that we had. This is not a rumor. This is not hearsay at this point. This is a public miracle with witnesses. There are people that are witnessing this happen, this man rising from the dead. And immediately we're seeing two different reactions here. Some people believe, while others run straight to the Pharisees and report what Jesus just did. Little tattletales. But what's important here is that no one is denying the miracle that just happened. The split isn't about whether Jesus has power. It's about what people are willing to do with that reality. Belief isn't blocked by lack of evidence here. It's blocked by what belief would require. Some people move closer, and others are just feeling threatened. So that brings us to our first reflection question in this. What do you usually do when something challenges your comfort, routines, or sense of control? You might notice that your first instinct isn't belief or rejection, it's self-protection. A lot of us don't think of ourselves as resistant to God. We think of ourselves as careful or thoughtful or responsible. And sometimes that can be true, right? But this passage shows us that fear can disguise itself as wisdom. So if this question, this first reflection question, feels uncomfortable at all, that doesn't mean you're doing faith wrong, or you're in the wrong part of this story, or you're just not understanding this correctly. It just means you're being honest. And Jesus isn't offended by hesitation. He's patient with it. So let's go ahead and move on. We're going to read verses 47 through 48. And that says, "So the chief priest and the Pharisees convened a Sanhedrin and were saying, 'What are we going to do since this man is doing so many signs? If we let them go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation.'" So the religious leaders gather to talk about Jesus. And what's striking is what they don't say. They don't say this didn't happen. They don't say he's lying. They say, "What are we going to do?" Their concern isn't spiritual confusion, it's fear. Fear of Rome, fear of losing power, fear of losing control. They're worried that if people keep believing in Jesus, everything they built will collapse. This moment reminds us that fear doesn't always show up as anger. Sometimes it just shows up as self-protection. They're trying to protect what they have. So for our next reflection question, where do you notice fear shaping your decisions more than trust? Now, fear rarely announces itself loudly, right? Most of the time, it sounds reasonable to us. It sounds like planning ahead, or being realistic, or not wanting to get hurt again. And that's why it's so easy to miss. Because this moment in John reminds us that fear doesn't make someone evil, it just makes them human. And Jesus steps into human fear without shaming it. So let's continue. We're going to read verses 49 through 52. And it says, "One of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, 'You know nothing at all. You are not considering that it is your advantage that one man should die for the people rather than the whole nation perish.' He did not say this on his own, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to unite the scattered children of God." So Caiaphas, and if I'm saying that incorrectly, I apologize, but he speaks up and says something super chilling. It's better that one man die for the people. He means this politically. He's saying, sacrifice Jesus so we don't lose everything else. But what's incredible here is that John tells us that Caiaphas doesn't even realize what he's saying. God uses his words to speak truth, even though his motives are wrong. Jesus will die for the people, but not to protect power, to bring salvation. This shows us something uncomfortable, but also important. God's purposes are not stopped by human corruption. Even when people act out of fear or control or power, God is still moving redemption forward. So for our next reflection question, this episode I feel like is going by super fast. For our next question, though, it says, have you ever justified something harmful because it felt necessary or protective? And this is a hard question. And it's okay if you don't have a clean or easy answer for it. Sometimes we don't recognize harm until we're already inside of it. What this passage shows us, though, is that God's redemption doesn't depend on our purity. He works even when motives are mixed, and that doesn't excuse harm, but it does remind us that grace is bigger than our worst decisions. So let's move on. We're going to continue on to verses 53 through 54. And that says, "So from that day on, they plotted to kill him. Jesus, therefore, no longer walked openly among the Jews, but departed from there to the countryside near the wilderness, to a town called Ephraim, and he stayed there with the disciples." So this is the turning point. From this day on, they plan to kill Jesus. Lazarus walks out of the grave, and Jesus begins walking towards the cross. This isn't a loss of control. This is the mission unfolding. Jesus doesn't retreat in fear. He moves quietly, intentionally, waiting for the right moment. The miracle didn't end in this story. It accelerated it. So for our next question, what do you do when following Jesus feels costly instead of comforting? Now, a lot of faith conversations focus on what Jesus gives. This passage reminds us that sometimes faith also costs us, not as a punishment, not as loss for loss's sake, but because love always moves towards people even when it's risky. If faith feels costly right now, which it can at times, that doesn't mean that you've missed something or that you're doing something wrong or you're not in the right place or other people are better than you because it's not costly for them. It just might mean that you're actually seeing something clearly, something that you weren't seeing before. So let's move on to our last section for the day. It's going to be verses 55 through 57. And that says, "Now the Jewish Passover was near, and many went up to Jerusalem from the country to purify themselves before the Passover. They were looking for Jesus and asking one another as they stood in the temple, 'What do you think? He won't come to the festival, will he?' The chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should report it so that they could arrest him." So Passover is near. The city is filling up. People are watching. People are whispering, "Do you think he'll come?" The leaders are ready. Orders are given. The trap is set. And the tension is thick. Everyone senses something is about to happen. Jesus could stay away, but he won't, because love doesn't avoid the cost of redemption. So for our last reflection question, what does it stir in you to know Jesus chose to walk toward danger and not away from it? Jesus didn't stumble into suffering. He walked towards it. Not because he enjoyed the pain by any means, but because he refused to abandon people. This is where the story stops being abstract. Jesus isn't asking us to admire him from a distance. He's showing us what love looks like when it's fully lived. And he does it without force. Now, John 11 doesn't just show us a miracle. This whole gospel or this whole chapter as a whole doesn't just show us this miracle of this man rising from the dead. Yes, it did happen, but that's not the whole picture here. It shows us how people respond when something undeniable happens. This man rose from the dead, and they are still trying to figure out what to do with this guy who made it happen. Some believed, some grow afraid, and some decide control matters way more than the truth does. They've seen it, they've heard it, they can't deny what happened. And Jesus, knowing exactly where this leads, keeps going. Faith here isn't about applause or certainty. It's about trust when the outcome is costly. If you've ever felt tension between believing and protecting yourself, this chapter doesn't rush you. It simply shows you who Jesus is and lets you decide how close you're willing to follow. If today's episode helped you see what happens after the miracle or helped you notice how fear and control can shape belief, would you just consider sharing it with someone who might need that too? If you're new here, welcome. You're already part of this little community. You can find this week's reflection questions and verses over on Instagram at the Even If Project. That's where we keep all the conversation going throughout the week. There's a link in the bio that I have the latest reflection questions posted in there. If they're not posted in a post on the main page. But next time, we'll be moving into John 12, where devotion, tension, and opposition all collide in one room. So bring your coffee, your Bible, and an open heart, and whatever questions you're carrying, and I'll meet you guys right back here. I love you all.